Right. Okay. Good morning, everyone, from here in London, and good evening if you're in East Asia. My name is Tachan Kong from SOAS, the University of London, and welcome to the second day of the Korean Global Forum for Peace. In this second day session, we're looking at realities and ways of peace building on the Korean Peninsula. We have four distinguished speakers for you. Each of the speakers will speak for approximately 5 to 10 minutes, and then this will be followed by questions and answers. So moving quickly on to the speakers, our first speaker is Professor Kim Jiyoung. Professor Kim is a professor at the Institute for Unification Education at the Ministry of Unification. Professor Kim is a specialist on Northeast Asian politics with particular reference to North Korea and China. He has a doctorate degree in political science from the University of Warwick, and prior to his current appointments, he served as a researcher at the Hanyang University's Institute of Chinese Studies. Professor Kim, welcome to the meeting. The floor is yours. Professor Kim, whilst we get those technical difficulties sorted out, I will proceed on to Dr. Alice Ekman. Dr. Ekman is a senior analyst for Asia at the European Union Institute for Security Studies. She's a specialist in East Asian security issues and has a particular interest in China, in which she's an expert. She was formerly the head of the China research at the French Institute of International Relations, and she has a PhD in international relations from the Sciences Po. So, Dr. Ekman, would you like to start?
Sure, Chair. Many thanks. Do you hear me well?
Yes, I do.
Okay, perfect. So I will start, and hoping then Professor Kim can join us later. And I think it will be perfect transition, because I would like in this 5 to 7 minutes to share with you some views on the China factor when it comes to peace building in the Korean Peninsula and the denuclearization process in general term. Why do I think it's important to focus on the China factor today? Because well, in recent years, as you know, the geostrategic context has evolved significantly, marked, in my opinion, by two major developments: reinforcement of China-US tensions, and also a rapprochement between China and Russia. And I would like to take into account this geostrategic context to share some analysis on the China factor impacting the Korean Peninsula. So according to me, taking into account the broader geostrategic context, there is four effects of four key points to take into account when we talk about China's approach toward the Korean Peninsula. The first important point to take into account, in my opinion, is clearly the return of ideology. Well, ideology has never disappeared from the Korean Peninsula, in particular has never disappeared from DPRK rhetoric. And it has never disappeared from CPC rhetoric in Beijing, but it has reinforced in Beijing over the last 7 years under Xi Jinping, not just from a domestic perspective, but also ideology is more than ever shaping China's foreign policy. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this is a main shaper of China's foreign policy. In many respects, China's foreign policy is following a realpolitik dynamic. It is also pragmatic in many respects, but still we have to acknowledge this return of ideology, because it has consequences on the way it relates with DPRK. At the context of China-US competition. Because this rhetoric is visible at two levels. First level, ideology is clearly visible when China covers the Korean War. As you know, many of you have noticed that on 23rd of October 2020, Xi Jinping commemorated what he called the 70th anniversary of the Chinese People's Volunteer entering the DPRK to fight the war. And especially he called them to promote the spirit, the war spirit forged in the war to resist US aggression and aid Korea. So this rhetoric is really much Cold War rhetoric, and it is more frequent, more important, and we should acknowledge it because that's really the frame that China is already communicating towards DPRK at the moment. Second level of ideology or return of ideology is not just regarding specifically China's approach and analysis of the Korean War, but it's more contemporary. It is regarding what China sees as a competition between political systems. To be more concrete, what binds China and DPRK today are not just pragmatic interests. We often refer to the buffer states, interest of China, as seen DPRK as a buffer state to limit the geographical scope of the US alliance in Northeast Asia. But also, if you look at ideological perspective, Xi Jinping clearly is talking, and I quote a speech from July 2020, cooperation between DPRK and China to make great contribution to advancing the socialist cause in both countries. Advancing the socialist cause, this is not a neutral term, right? And this has echo in DPRK. Once again, I'm not saying that ideology is the main shaper, but the return of ideology should be acknowledged because it has an impact on ties and the nature of ties developed and intensified between Pyongyang and Beijing. In concrete terms, I really anticipate a reinforcement of bilateral ties in the coming years between the two capitals. As a reminder, you're aware that since March 2018, Kim Jong-un visited China 4 times. In June 2019, the two countries were celebrating the 70th anniversary of diplomatic ties to a great extent. I see in the coming years multiple, I would say, party-to-party occasion to symbolize and to show to a domestic and global audience a rapprochement between two countries. I'm thinking, for instance, about the centenary of the CPC next year in 2021. And as you know, Xi Jinping has called for the reinforcement of party-to-party ties. So when there is a clear call from Beijing to reinforce strategic communication with Pyongyang, this will first and foremost pass through this channel of party-to-party ties, which is quite unique considering the shared, with the institutional framework between China and North Korea, although of course there is some divergences. A question mark here when we anticipate a rapprochement between Pyongyang and Beijing, sorry, is the impact of COVID or post-COVID cooperation. I might be mistaken, and some of my colleagues might correct me, but so far it seems that the cooperation under COVID is rather limited. I mean, DPRK has shut down even more than before with aid package not sought at the China border, but China will do its maximum to try to promote health cooperation and even digital cooperation in the post-COVID era in the coming months and years. This might be a long-term trend. Second point I would like to emphasize when we talk about the China factor is the promotion of alternative political and security norms today. Clearly, for China, there is more than ever the imperative to oppose any regime change. And of course, this applies to North Korea. And I would like to take into account the broader geostrategic context because there is a Russia-China alignment on this normative dimension. Both are talking about the new security concept and both actually are keen to cooperate or to coordinate in some extent to oppose any type of regime change in multilateral organization, including at the UN, in a broader framework of competition between political systems that China is advocating. The first point, more concrete point, is about socialization of DPRK. What I mentioned, socialization of DPRK. I believe that China is keen, actually, under its policy of enlarging its so-called circle of friends, is keen to integrate DPRK and to invite DPRK in the many initiatives that it is launching. Of course, I'm referring to forums such as the Belt and Road Forum, where an edition might be organized again in the coming years. I'm thinking about Yangshan Forum. In the previous edition of the Security Forum organized in Beijing, we were witnessing a large DPRK participation. I'm thinking about, in general term, all the initiatives that China may launch in the coming years under the broad Belt and Road label that will not disappear in the post-COVID era. And I really anticipate not only a reinforcement of bilateral ties between Beijing and Pyongyang, but also reinforcement of China's invitation of DPRK to join multilateral gathering that China is organizing or supervising in one way or another. And I think this socialization process will happen without precondition of denuclearization. This will not be a precondition set by China beforehand. I see China clear separation between this socialization process at multilateral level and the denuclearization process, which is sees as a completely different dynamic. Fourth point I would like to mention regarding the China factor is related to the last point I was mentioning, is the fact that there is an asymmetry of calendar, and I see a deliberate attempt from China's side to slow down the denuclearization process or attempt of negotiation. I know this is quite a straightforward comment, but I think we have to acknowledge that for China, DPRK in the Korean Peninsula is not the most urgent flashpoint on its agenda. In terms of hierarchy of priority, first of all, China has a lot on her plate, but priorities that come first is Hong Kong situation in Hong Kong, is also South China Sea is an important flashpoint that China is dedicating a lot of time and attention, and also Taiwan, which is an important point of tension that may remain very much high on the agenda, including under the Biden administration. And I believe that for China, more than ever, this is part of the great renewal of the Chinese nation. And in this respect, the Korean Peninsula comes later after this point, and therefore China will not be an accelerator of any discussion or negotiation process, because I think it's not in its interest and it's not a priority, generally speaking. My colleagues may disagree with me, but I wanted to be straightforward to launch a provocative discussion on this. To conclude, I see three key strategic questions in this context. The first one is, what is the effect of the re-ideologicization of China's approach to the Korean Peninsula, short-term and long-term? A second key strategic question I would like to share with you is, what will be the effect of the multilateral socialization of DPRK at the initiative of China? In concrete terms, we often mention the DPRK looking or searching for US attention. And this is a matter of fact that DPRK want to engage with Washington, or want to catch the attention of Washington in many respects. But if it gains a form of social international status, sorry, not social, but international status and recognition through other means, thanks to China, will it still follow the same dynamic and seek for the same time of international attention than before? Maybe this will progressively change, because it will gain, it will receive attention from the side of Beijing. And the third key strategic question I would like to share with you are related to the modalities and effect of Belt and Road on the Korean Peninsula. I know there have been a lot of up and downs, and we cannot say really that the DPRK now is fully integrated within China's Belt and Road framework. But I believe China will continue to propose so-called Belt and Road initiative, especially initiative related to the health Silk Road, but also the digital Silk Road towards its neighbor. And a longer-term question, I think it would be interesting to follow the scope and limits of China DPRK technological cooperation, being official cooperation or gray or black market cooperation in the future, at a time when there is emerging technological decoupling between China and the US, but also an incentive and an ambition on the side of China to really export its technological offer, being a product or more comprehensive services to implement in daily life. So I will stop here, and I hope I wasn't too long.
Thanks very much, Dr. Ekman. Is Professor Kim ready to give his presentation?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, okay. I do apologize for the delay, and just let me start my presentation. The title of my presentation is A Strategy for Building Peace on the Korean Peninsula in U.S. Presidential Transition, Declaration of End of the War. This is my focus, basically. So this presentation tried to explain what the declaration of the end of the war means to build peace on the Korean Peninsula in the face of the US administration change and the worsening public opinion in South Korea. First of all, let me just explain the background. North Korea's economy will grow minus 8.5% this year, the worst since the March of difficulties period in the 1990s. If COVID-19 goes by the end of the next year, there could be a big crisis, which is argued by experts on North Korean economy. And the new administration in the US would take a year to at least evaluate foreign policy and deploy a foreign policymakers on North Korea denuclearization until July next year. So under this circumstance, North Korea could also try to pressure the US through provocation against the South to restart negotiation with the United States. So North Korea's military provocation could delay the start of negotiations with the new US administration, or cause a threat which increases insecurity on the Korean Peninsula. South Korea's focus, therefore, is on restarting the denuclearization and the peace process on the Korean Peninsula without being affected by the change of US administration. And South Korea's President Moon Jae-in repeatedly addressed the importance of the end of the war declaration before the US presidential election. In particular, he emphasized it at 75th session of United Nations General Assembly, 23rd September 2020. So I just explained the three terms. The first of all, North Korea's economic situation. The second of all, I explained what's the point of the new administration in United States in terms of North Korea denuclearization and the peace on the Korean Peninsula. The third, that's why the South Korean government should try to set declaration end of the war. And then I moved to definition of the declaration of the end of the war. First of all, a peace treaty includes a declaration of the end of war, compensation for war, post-war processing, and peace settlement, and is concluded in a bilateral or multilateral format. If the process of signing a peace treaty is complicated and takes a long time, it may go through the declaration of the end of the war, may go through a trust-building process before signing a peace treaty. So the declaration of the end of the war could mean the stipulation on the end of the war included in the peace treaty. And also it could mean the declaration of the end of the war followed the argument of the fighting parties on the end of the legal war, or the declaration of the unilateral end of the war by the victorious side of the war whose victories or defeat is clearly obscured. And also it may mean a political declaration or agreement in which the parties to the engagement declaration internally and externally that the state of the war is over. So we should pay attention to its practical nature and content rather than the term end of the war declaration itself. If we consider that the declaration of the end of the war is precursor to a peace treaty, the transition to a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula involves a number of complex issues, such as war responsibility, non-aggression, arms control, peace management, South Korea-US alliance, UNC and unification issues directly and indirectly. So if we look back the contemporary history, the Panmunjom Declaration in 2018 addressed the issue of a peace regime, and the 4th October Summit Declaration in 2007 included this issue of declaration, the end of the war, and which politically declares the end of the war rather than legally replacing the armistice. And the declaration of the end of the war will include the end of the war, non-negotiation, non-aggression, and ways to push for peace treaty in the future. So with this kind of definition, I would like to I would like to explain a strategy toward the peace building in a US presidential transition. Basically, the US Congress is creating atmosphere to support the declaration of the end to Korean Peninsula to promote denuclearization and peace. The 2020 Defense Authorization Act adopted by the US House of Representatives. This is July 2019, and the US Senate is September 2019 contains the content that urges the promotion of the end of the war on the Korean Peninsula. And also October 31st October 2020, 51 members of the US House of Representatives have signed the resolution for the declaration of the end of the Korean Peninsula. And all three candidates for the next House Representatives Foreign Relations Chairman all agreed to resolution. If the adoption of the end of the war declaration resolves the political status of an enemy state, it is feared that the basis for application of a Trading with the Enemy Act will disappear. But it is unlikely that the act will be applied to North Korea as it continues to be redesigned as a state sponsor of terrorism. So it is necessary to clarify the legal nature of the declaration of the end of the war in order to prevent it from being used to dismantle the UNC or shake up the South Korea-US alliance. So which US Article 2, paragraph 1st of the Vienna Convention on the nature of the treaty. So if the declaration is carried out in consideration of the formats and contents of the declaration, there will be no problem in becoming a symbolic and a political agreement without legal binding force. In terms of these contents, if the military armistice agreement is legally binding until final peace treaty is signed, or if it contains their purpose, it can further clearly reveal the symbolic and limited nature of the declaration of the end of the war. And this is the end of my presentation. So to sum up, basically North Korea's economy is getting worse due to COVID-19, and then there is a administration transition in the United States. Because of these two conditions, there might be a possibility of military conflict in the next 2 or 3 months. So for prevention, this kind of conflict between two sides, South Korean government to try to set up this declaration, the end of the war, in the next couple of months. Yeah, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. And our third speaker is Dr. Nicholas Swanstrom. Dr. Swanstrom is a director of the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Sweden. He's also one of its co-founders. He's also a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He's an expert at conflict prevention, conflict management, regional cooperation, traditional and non-traditional security issue, amongst many other things. And he holds a PhD in peace and conflict studies at Uppsala University. Dr. Swanstrom, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And well, first of all, let me congratulate you on arranging this event, even if I'd rather be in London or in Seoul than being standing in my office in Stockholm. When we talk about the reality and the ways of peace building, I'm going to be rather pessimistic in a sense, but at the same time trying to pick out the optimistic aspects we can still work with. And I would argue there's very little that indicates a major breakthrough in the short to medium term. North Korea doesn't really have any reasons to do it, and I'll come back to that. And Alice have already hinted to one of the factors, which is China. But normally then the pessimists argue that there's nothing we can do. We should really increase sanctions and refuse contact with DPRK. And the optimists would say, no, we need to decrease sanctions, we need to engage, we need to give them what they want, and they will come around. I think the reality is really in between. Boringly enough, it's rather a gray, slow-moving unconformity that needs to be understood and approached. So I think the first thing we need to accept is that North Korea will not denuclearize. It's not the case of developing nuclear weapons to trade them, and it's never been. I mean, I think the North Koreans has been very consistent with this during all the years I've been working with the North Koreans. They didn't develop the nuclear weapons because it was a financially incentive, where they could have done better things with the money. They developed it for security reasons, and this is nothing we can solve short term. On the other hand, there's something we can work with once you sort of accept the fact that the North Koreans have, in their perspective, legitimate security concerns. You can start with dealing with it. The dilemma we have is that, should we lift the sanctions? Well, we put the sanctions there because they develop nuclear weapons. We can't lift the sanctions because they say we're not going to develop more nuclear weapons. On the other hand, if you increase the sanctions, you will add an opportunity for states like Russia, China to move in much more actively. So this is always a break in sort of an argument, a balance between the facts. I think the other one is for North Korea. South Korea is not a priority. North Korea could be willing to work with Seoul, but in Pyongyang, there's a realization, and has been for a while, that the conflict between United States and China is something they can utilize. North Korea has been experts in balancing between China and United States. And as we see a greater polarization between Beijing and Washington, Pyongyang sees an opportunity. And I think they're extremely skillful in dealing with this. I think there is, and I will come back to that, but I think there's a limit to how far North Korea is willing to go with its relations with China, because they don't want to exchange one major, pressure point against another one, but nevertheless. And North Korea and United States is really too far from each other right now. And I don't think it's going to change much with Biden. Biden have other issues to deal with. I'm not sure the Congress will hand him a victory in Korea. So I think that United States is still not a very active player. And therefore, as Alice pointed out, I mean, China will be the major player when it comes to DPRK. Unfortunately, I think for South Korea and the international community for the time being. But not only for ideological reasons, I think it's realpolitik. I think it is a way for China to increase its regional pressure, but also to balance this against the United States. And as actually Alice pointed out, the Yangshan Forum, I got my invitation a couple of weeks back to Yangshan Forum. This year is going to be a virtual one. It's going to be interesting to see if the North Koreans participate, because they have been reluctant. But nevertheless, even if I'm slightly pessimistic, I think engagement is absolutely necessary. It doesn't mean we're going to end the sanctions. I think we have to find a process. And it was yesterday, it was also mentioned that we need to find a process that's acceptable for everyone. It's a need for a tit-for-tat roadmap that is realistic to all parties. And this is where we need to look at the different perception of the states. What is the value of each step? I mean, the North Koreans actually is strongly convinced that not testing more nuclear weapons is a great concession, and we should lift parts of the sanction for it. This is not something the Congress would agree to, the United States Congress would agree to. So we need to figure out what is the value. Lifting sanctions is worth what? No tests is worth what? And we need to try to create a value between this difference. And this is where I think the engagement is absolutely necessary. And we need to have that engagement driven by realist perceptions rather than hopefulness. And I also would argue that we need strong regional structures, partly to guide DPRK, but also to ensure stability and to ensure that there's a roadmap to it. The negative part, Northeast Asia has no regional experience. There's still a great deal of Cold War mentality in the region, the Sino-US tension. And I don't really see the regional structure being possible. On the other hand, without the regional structure, I think we're going to be facing sort of a very on and off sort of regional engagement. So when you look at the short to medium term, I think we're looking at the muddling through process. We're basically going to try things. We might take 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, 1 step forward, 2 steps backward. But to ensure that we have a proper direction, we need to have that sort of multilateral structures of some kind that can ensure stability. The good part is Biden is more willing to engage in multilateral structures. I think it's going to be difficult to get the North Koreans on board. This is something we deal with a lot, but I'm still, they're very reluctant. A final point, just when we talked about, Dr. Kim was saying that he mentioned 8.5%, and I think we should be extremely careful with when we talk about the economic development in North Korea, ups and downs. When I travel to North Korea, I mean, we see these campaigns going on. The Malima campaign was very active. We see a lot of growth in domestic production. Take, for example, what I try to, unfortunately, I maybe consume too much, but candy. The variety of sort of luxury goods has increased significantly, and it's all locally produced. And this is something that we do see in North Korea. There's a lot of local production. We see a lot of indications of breaking sanctions from China and Russia, etc. So I think they will manage. They have enormous economic problems, as we all have, but I don't think it's going to break their back. So I would be a bit careful when we talk about economic figures. I'm going to end there and apologize. I think I did 8 minutes and 30 seconds. So, Professor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swanstrom. And the fourth speaker today is Dr. Song Ki-young, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute of National Security Studies. National Security Studies, he's a senior research fellow in the Security Strategy Research Division. Prior to joining the Institute for National Security Studies, Dr. Song, he worked for many years at the Korea Institute of National Unification, during which time he also worked on the Presidential Committee for Unification Preparation as a policy advisor. and also for the Ministry of Unification as a Director General for Unification Policy. And Dr. Song has a PhD in International Studies from the University of Warwick. So Dr. Song, welcome, the floor is yours. Dr. Song, you need to switch off your microphone, switch on your microphone.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for organizing this event and moderating this session, Professor Kong, and thank you again for my Korean and European colleagues for your presentation. Before me, Nicholas nicely sketched out the broad picture of where we are in the Korean Peninsula peace process. I personally agree many elements of what he said. At the same time, it also justifies the reason why I chose sustainability for my presentation topic today. I think this is not the right timing to seek a short-term harvest in a hasty manner. I do think this is the right timing or desirable timing to seek sustainability in dealing with North Korea, and at the same time in building peace on the Korean Peninsula. So let me start off why we need sustainability in dealing with North Korea at the moment. First of all, we need to accept that the fact that international society failed to denuclearize North Korea. If you look back on the past efforts for the denuclearization of North Korea, it has been a repetition of North Korea's continued nuclear development, followed by the sanctions of the international community. Sometimes we put pressure on North Korea through coercive measures when North Korea derailed the denuclearization negotiation. But when North Korea showed enough commitment for the implementation of the denuclearization agreement, we promised to provide North Korea with economic support. In this pendulum between pressure and engagement, the North Korea policy failed to show consistency and durability. The suspension of the denuclearization negotiation after the Hanoi summit February last year implies that the security guarantee of the North Korean regime needs to go together with denuclearization agreement in order to pursue sustainable peace building on the Korean Peninsula. We need to remember that Chairman Kim Jong-un's initial commitment to the complete denuclearization was not a unilateral promise to denuclearize itself, but a conditional statement saying that they have no reason to possess nuclear weapons with condition if military threat is removed and regime security is guaranteed. However, international society did not pay enough attention to the regime security issues. Rather, we only focus on denuclearization. In my view, it is expected that the next round of denuclearization talks, if it ever happens, will and should discuss how to reformulate the security architecture on the Korean Peninsula together with the technical process of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Another reason for us to formulate more sustainable North Korea policy is the heightened tension between the United States and China in this region. As my European colleagues mentioned, as long as the US-China strategic competition continues, North Korea is going to try to make full use of the competition in order to maximize their strategic gain from each side. If you look at the economic side of things, a sustainable North Korea policy will facilitate market activities up and down the country in North Korea. As a result, resilience of the North Korean socio-economic system is expected to grow. And it is also likely to eventually bring about domestic reform in North Korea, hopefully. Sustainable engagement is necessary because we have to focus on providing North Korea with economic capability to improve people's living standard. Kim Jong-un has been emphasizing the importance of economic development by introducing what they call economic construction concentration line. This policy line was declared at a party plenum meeting in March 2018, just before Kim Jong-un started proactive summit diplomacy with China, the United States, and South Korea. But as a result of the Hanoi failure, in which Kim Jong-un's attempt to accomplish sanction relief failed, he had no option but to acknowledge the failure of his economic policy. In addition, the 8th Party Congress in January next year is expected to announce another 5-year national economic development plan. It also signals the establishment of a new economic policy line to overcome its chronic economic difficulties. This kind of a series of practical measures to reconstruct its economy is a meaningful departure from North Korean side of which will replace the military-first politics in his father's days. So, international society should encourage North Korea not to retreat from its pledge of economic development strategy as a national goal. How can we achieve these goals? I have no definite answer, but what I can tell you at the moment is several directions to which international society and the South Korean government has to go. First of all, we need to acknowledge that the past North Korea policy failed to bring about a desired outcome. Maximum pressure did not work as intended, and maximum engagement also failed to find its momentum to be implemented. The main reason for the failure of the maximum pressure campaign is China. China's involvement to unofficially support the North Korean economy. So theoretically, as long as China opens a backdoor to North Korea, the full implementation of any denuclearization agreement cannot be completed. In contrast, if you assume that in some time under the Biden administration, if we are able to invite China to the denuclearization talks, it will also put pressure on North Korea not to resume provocative behavior, at least while the multilateral talks involving also China continues. So we will need to figure out a new pattern of negotiation framework, such as four-party talks, which we used to try in the 1990s. From Europe's point of view, such a situation is likely to bring a more flexible pattern of security dialogue platform to deal with the Korean Peninsula issues. Together with consistent efforts for denuclearize North Korea, we need to pay equal attention to the livelihood of the people in the country for the sustainable policy to North Korea. Humanitarian assistance includes many different areas of cooperation between North Korea and the outside world. Medical support to respond to the COVID-19, and transfer of agricultural technology to resolve chronic food shortage in North Korea can be some examples for the humanitarian approach. One thing I was very much impressed by the Europe's approach to the developing countries was what they call LLD, meaning linking relief, rehabilitation, and development in delivering humanitarian assistance to the poor countries. This kind of idea also can show the rest of the world what the sustainable North Korea policy should be like, I think. Human security is also an increasingly important issue on the Korean Peninsula. Disaster prevention and epidemic control turned out to be a very critical and important task of the political leadership of North Korea throughout the flood and pandemic this year. So in this sense, it is timely for the European countries to engage with North Korea in the human security issues. Last but not least, human rights situation in North Korea poses very difficult challenges in sustainable North Korea policy. The European Union played a very pioneering role in raising awareness of North Korea's human rights situation by discussing human rights agenda in the bilateral dialogue with North Korea, and also by leading the United Nations collective efforts to deplore the human rights violation in North Korea. So balance is important. Balance between positive incentives and coercive measures is important for sustainable human rights policy toward North Korea. For example, the high-level political dialogues between the EU and the DPRK back in 2000 can give us a very useful example to follow in case we see a meaningful progress in the denuclearization talks in the near future, probably next year or so. In any case, sustainable human rights policy toward North Korea should focus on how to internationalize the perception and practice of the North Korean leadership on human rights, not to isolate them. Such an approach is likely to facilitate North Korea's willingness to deal with human rights based on the international standard. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Song. I have some follow-up questions for the speaker. So perhaps I will begin with Dr. Song to follow up on the inter-Korean relations aspects, the emerging security situation between the two Koreas. In his 10th of October speech, Kim Jong-un appeared to be reaching out to the South Korean side. But then in the summer, we saw the North Korean demolition of the Inter-Korean Liaison Office in Kaesong, also criticisms of the role of South Korea, that South Korea is not an interlocutor between North Korea and the United States. So what do you think is the North Korean attitude towards inter-Korean relations? Because they appear to be sending mixed signals. Dr. Song.
Yes, thank you for raising very important point from the South Korean government's point of view. Yes, you're right. The situation of inter-Korean relation is terribly bad, worse than ever. But the main reason of this bad situation is not just from the de facto group in South Korea's leaflet issues, agitation leaflet issues condemning Kim Jong-un leadership, not just from the very slow speed of inter-Korean relations improvement after the Panmunjom Declaration. I think the main reason was coming from the Hanoi summit failure between Chairman Kim Jong-un and President Trump. Since then, the inter-Korean relations has deteriorated a lot. Because of North Korea's discontent at the failure of the summit, North Korea, I think, initially believed that the South Korea played a mediating role, enough a level of mediating role in harvesting Kim Jong-un's diplomatic legacy with President Trump by accomplishing the UN sanctions relief, if not lift, on the condition of the Yongbyon abandonment. But this Hanoi failure became a critical moment for North Korea. No longer trust to South Korea, Korea's constructive role between the United States and the DPRK. Since then, North Korea has not responded to South Korea's offer for even several non-political, purely humanitarian cooperative projects. And moreover, in June this year, North Korea demolished the Inter-Korean Liaison Office in Kaesong and declared the South-North Korea relations is no longer a partnership. It's enemy relationship from that time on. But luckily enough, it was fortunate that in a few days later, Kim Jiyoung stopped this anti-South campaign led by his sister Kim Jiyoung. And more recently, Kim Jiyoung expressed his friendship to the South Korean people in his speech in October. On the other hand, North Korea's rising concern on healthcare and the people's living standard may open a possibility for inter-Korean cooperation in the relevant field. One of the key decisions at the Supreme People's Assembly of North Korea in April this year was to increase their healthcare budget by 7.4%. It was the biggest increase in recent years. The budget field that showed the biggest increase this year was science and technology. Healthcare was the second. In contrast, the defense budget this year did not show any meaningful increase. So at this juncture, for the South Korean government, I think it is worth continuing to send messages for the possible cooperation project between the South and the North. In particular, South and North Korea share many non-traditional emerging security issues occurring near border areas. For example, this year in rainy season, North Korea opened the dam water very near the borderline between the South and North without any prior notice to the South side. So it occurs almost every summer. At times it kills many South Korean innocent people who has been living on the riverbank. Other issue is kind of livestock epidemics such as African swine fever and forest pasturation, almost annual incident near the inter-Korean border. We had similar natural disasters in the past. For example, in the 1990s, there was a spread of malaria in the western side border cities in South Korea. Also, the forest pestilence occurred in the eastern mountainous areas that destroyed the large part of the forest. Both originated from North Korea. So if North Korea fails to control this kind of natural disaster or epidemic, human or livestock, it will directly affect South Korean lives. So the joint response system to building an organized joint response system to this kind of emerging security issues is not the issue of unilateral humanitarian aid to North Korea. It will not prop up North Korea's nuclear capability. Rather, this is much needed joint humanitarian reaction to the emerging human security issues. So I would say that this is the desirable point. We can kickstart again the inter-Korean relations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Song. And turning to Dr. Nicholas Swanstrom, you mentioned that the North Koreans will not denuclearize. They believe in maintaining their nuclear weapons capacity to some degree. But since 2017, they've shown some degree of restraint. They've not tested any more nuclear weapons. I think they've not launched any more satellites, but they conducted some rocket engine tests. And in Hanoi, they offered to dismantle the nuclear facility at Yongbyon and Tongchangni, the launch site at the West Sea. So you mentioned about we need to do something. But the North Koreans will not denuclearize, but they have made some gestures. They have made some offers. What are those offers worth? What should they be given in exchange for those offers? Can what the North Koreans are willing to give, can that be matched by concessions from the US and the international community in some way?
Well, I mean, I do agree. I mean, from 2017, there's been a restraint in terms of there's been no testing. And I think the North Koreans, again, has been very explicit about this. For the North Koreans, it is a great deal about security. And as been mentioned before as well, I mean, we need to focus a bit on their security and the perception of security. We might disagree with this, but that's how they feel very strongly. One thing, of course, is, do they need more tests? The reality is we don't know. And I think in a sense that for them, they probably have enough capacity to create disturbances. And if they would continue doing the tests, the impact would be much worse. But if you're going to move forward into something more constructive and discuss what can be considered a long-term denuclearization, and I'm talking long-term, we need to engage them. And this is, I think actually what South Korea can do really well is to engage them in disaster management of sorts. And I think that we work with the North Koreans on that, and that can eventually be tied into the nuclear field as well, but also about regional security, to focus on a broader problem, not only on the Korean Peninsula, not only on North Korea, that North Korea needs to denuclearize, put it in a regional context. The North Koreans would be more willing to discuss that because suddenly they would be just a part of the problem. They would not be the single problem. So I think there is a momentum to be made here, and I think that we could move forward. Yongbyon was, of course, a signal from the North Koreans, an expensive one. But the nuclear program was not dependent on Yongbyon. And I think what we need to look at, and to be honest also, we also talking about nuclear weapons, we also need to talk about conventional weapons. This is not only about nuclear weapons. But I think what we need to look at is also submarine development. You mentioned the engine, the launch technology, the missile technology. This is really where the weak spots in the North Korean nuclear program are. Engagement. I mean, it's about finding the right forms of engagement. And actually, the OPCON transfer is actually, the North Koreans view South Korea as a puppet of United States, of course. The OPCON transfer could actually potentially signal to the North Koreans that South Korea might be an actor to deal with when it comes to security. So even if I sort of am negative about major breakthroughs, I think the North Koreans are willing to go in and discuss this. And but we should be looking at this in a broader context and a more long-term context. To expect total denuclearization is, yeah, it's not going to happen right now. And I think this is the big problem, well, COVID-19 has saved us in a sense because the North Koreans were handling their internal problems, but if there's no concessions from the international community, I think we can expect more tests, maybe not nuclear tests, but tests of other sorts in as soon as the COVID-19 crisis is past a bit. And because, yeah, they need to develop their technology unless they get some sort of concessions. But again, why should we lift sanctions or that we put in place because they developed nuclear weapons? There has to be other forms we can look into. And I think then disaster management is one way of approaching them. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swanstrom. And Professor Kim, I have a question for you. Given North Korea's own insecurity perceptions, to arrive at a peace agreement, what kind of adjustments do you think would need to be made in the United States, South Korea security relationship?
You mean the peace agreement, or I mean the declaration of the end of the war?
Well, moving forward, if we're to have a declaration to the end of the war, from armistice to the settlement of the Korean War, towards a kind of a long-term peaceful relations.
Mm-hmm.
What would need to change in the U.S. South Korea security alliance, given that South Korea is very much still wedded to the U.S. To the alliance with the United States, but at the same time, the North Koreans often talks about how the threat this poses to their security, the joint exercises every year they make a lot of noise about. So how do you see these two this tension being redressed in some way?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Basically, as you mentioned, probably the North Korea feel the threat from the military exercise between the United States and South Korea. This is a practical term. But as I explained in my presentation, the legal term, basically North Korea consider the United States is dealing with North Korea as a hostile country. So in terms of the law, probably North Korea consider still the United States, if they don't remove this kind of hostility from the legal term, they still feel kind of a threat from the United States. So I think we need a approach of step by step. The first step is the reason why actually I raised this issue of the declaration of the end of the war. This is a transitional strategy to just on track of negotiation between North Korea and United States. As I explained, North Korea's economic situation is getting worse because of COVID-19, and the United States probably they need time to set up North Korean policy and also a department in the next 6 or 7 months. But if you look back the history, North Korean regime, they in the beginning of every new U.S. administration, they try to test the willingness of a North Korean policy of the United States. For the test, North Korea launched a missile, or they tested nuclear weapons. So probably in South Korea, many people are concerning this kind of happening, because North Korea's situation, they need kind of restart negotiation as soon as possible to solve out their kind of economic crisis in the next year. So probably the need of the declaration of the end of the war is probably we can hold North Korea, or we can signal, we can give a signal to North Korea, we're gonna have a negotiation soon, and until that happens, probably we can at least have a trust building between North Korea and the United States. So I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, so the declaration is not kind of a practical security to North Korea. This is kind of a political signal to North Korea, which is for persuading North Korea on the track of negotiation until next July, which probably Biden administration will start to negotiate with North Korea? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Kim. And turning to Dr. Ekman, you mentioned that the denuclearization of North Korea is not the top priority for both the incoming Biden administration or for China right now. That they have more pressing things to deal with. In that situation, how do you expect the North Koreans to respond to this situation of being neglected by the United States and China?
Actually, I was mentioning that for China, denuclearization process is not a priority. As I'm not a US expert, I haven't developed too much on Biden's approach, but I would tend to agree that at least for the coming months, he will have also many things on his plate, and first and foremost, shaping a China policy in particular that is reflecting the so-called bipartisan consensus that we are witnessing on Washington, relative bipartisan consensus on China. Really, I really echo what Niklas has said, and as well Professor Song saying that DPRK itself is exploiting or is trying to utilize US-China tension. And I think this will continue more than ever. But I wanted to underline in my presentation really that I think China, when it comes to denuclearization process, is not a facilitating, is not an accelerator, an accelerating stakeholder. Is more trying, has more interest and incentive to slow down the process than to accelerate it if it has an impact on the pace. And I think it does have an impact on the speed and the overall development of the process for the reason I mentioned previously. But I would go even further, saying not only China is not facilitating the denuclearization process, but at this point in time, I wonder if nuclear North Korea is not in the interest of China. For a long time, we said, well, it's a neighbor, so it's not in the interest of China to have nuclear power next to its border. An accident can always happen. It's unsafe. It's so close, etc. But really, when you see the evolution of regional tension shaped by U.S.-China rivalry, I think that as part of its new approach toward the so-called circle of friends, and I mentioned this again, we can, of course, read in between the line of official communication saying this is just speeches, but all indicate that China is looking towards a reinforcement of its tie with Pyongyang. And there is never the issue of denuclearization mentioned recently in communication. And even if you remember before, when China was often referring to a dual track process of suspension for suspension, it was always conditioned to basically South Korea giving away something before North Korea would be able to consider also the denuclearization process or giving away something as well. But in this context, really, that's why also I emphasize the role of Russia. But something is building up now in Northeast Asia and the broader Asia region, which is reinforced bipolarization. In which I think China and Russia will never contradict themselves. I'm not saying for China is much more involved and much more concerned about, of course, situation in Northeast Asia than Russia is. But if China takes position or slow down or have an effect on the process, Russia I don't think will contradict. And Russia has also its own interest and motivation. And when we look at different issues, such as the South China Sea issue, Russia is not fully aligned with China's position on South China Sea, but it's not contradicting it neither. Because in the end, we now are heading towards a restructuring of the region and the world into not necessarily Cold War blocs, but poles that shape most of the security issue at stake, and first and foremost, the Korean Peninsula issue. For China, the question is not to develop an alternative alliance system. And as you know, Russia and China have not signed an alliance treaty and are not planning to sign a treaty anytime soon. But still, military cooperation has been forced, to put on a footnote. But as you know, they are building a helicopter to be ready, military helicopter to be ready in 2030. Also, Russia is helping China to develop early warning system to prevent missile attack, etc., etc. But more than ever, they are cooperating in a key security institution and architecture of the region, and both, I think, don't have incentive to put denuclearization high on this agenda. But what we are seeing, and to go back to the alliance or non-alliance system building by China, what we are seeing is the formation of two groups of countries. One, of course, is shaped by the US alliance system, which is rather clear-cut, and the US Washington is expecting clarity on positioning of its allies, and this is likely to continue under the Biden administration. At the same time, you have China that is trying to reinforce ambiguity in who is its partner and allies in the region, but trying really to enlarge its circle of friends. But for China, some countries now are moving from just friends to very good friends, best friend. That's the labeling we are hearing these days when we read and we study China's official communication. And some of these countries include Pakistan, Russia, Algeria. And in my opinion, North Korea now is starting to move toward the closer group of friends that China has identified. We don't have evidence clear-cut, but we have at least signs that China wants to reinforce its ties with North Korea, and also signs that North Korea will do its best to utilize China-US tension. I agree with Niklas when he says that North Korea will be careful not to go too far, too closer to China, because it has an interest in balancing its I would say the leverage that and the attraction that it might generate in one way or another. But the trend is there. So really, all in all, I was emphasizing that I mean, I'm not saying that there is no possibility for further negotiation, discussion, interaction. I'm just thinking that really today China will not be a facilitator, at least not a facilitator in the objective that we are aiming at, which is denuclearization. Because apart from the accident hypothesis, nuclear North Korea, I don't think is seen as such as a, I would say it's an issue, but I don't think it's seen as such a priority issue to really address and directly seek solution in the present context. And we could also, but I won't develop too much on the role of the EU, because it was really the focus of the session yesterday. But in this context, I wouldn't bet too much on bilateral dialogue between EU and China on the Korean Peninsula, or putting this issue on the bilateral agenda. First, because there is many other things on the agenda, and of course there is a point of tension also between Brussels and Beijing. But moving away from this bilateral dialogue, I think really the EU has been and could be a convening power, both at EU level and EU member states. As it has been remembered, emphasized, there is 6 EU member state embassies in Pyongyang. This president has lessened with COVID, but is likely to be back and to be of use. And more than ever, I think it would be the role of the EU to move away from the ideological frame that is increasingly weighting on the peninsula. And for that, I guess, of course, concrete cooperation on very, very specific and frame issues such as disaster relief, medical cooperation, human security, and other area of cooperation that has been mentioned by Professor Kim would be useful. But I would like to add one point, is that for EU to be a relevant stakeholder, relevant partner, it needs also our case recognition as such. And I understand that perception differs in Seoul, but we still hear very much the perception that basically the EU is too far away, cannot do much, is not a relevant partner when it comes to either denuclearization process or peace building process. I think this is not necessarily based on relevant fact, on clear-cut fact, but more by a lack of knowledge of EU's modus operandi and foreign policy orientation in previous term, and also lack of understanding on EU's activism in shaping and framing the JCPOA agreement.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ekman. I have a question actually for Dr. Song, again, about the issue of sanctions. For a former minister of unification, I think Lee Jong-sok has talked about the so-called snapback, the use of a snapback clause that you know, we can take a risk on alleviating sanctions on North Korea by the use of a snapback clause, that if North Korea, if sanctions are alleviated and then they go back to their nuclear development, then then this could be it could actually be the alleviation of sanctions could be reversed. What do you think of such a strategy as one way to move forward? So the North Koreans are given the benefit of the doubt, but if they violate the trust, then any benefits could be reversed.
There is a condition on it. If the South Korean government and the new Biden administration agrees that we are ready to accept North Korea's offer for the meaningful step for the denuclearization, at least they promised in the Singapore summit or the Hanoi summit, which means the total lockdown of Yongbyon facility. Of course, among many experts, there are different perceptions. Some people say that Yongbyon is the most part of the North Korea's nuclear development capability, but some hardliners said that Yongbyon is nothing. But in my opinion, Yongbyon destruction is at least enough level of starting point for the long-term goal of the complete and verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Under this kind of consensus between the South Korean government and the new Biden administration, then we can begin to discuss the possibility of sanction alleviation with condition that the snapback clause you mentioned. So in principle, I think the snapback clause is meaningful safety measures, not to go back to the nuclear armament and continued nuclear development and increasing their nuclear capability after receiving the sanction relief or sanction alleviation measures from the United Nations. But more importantly, I think is before that, the more important issue at this point is to make an agreement between the US and the South Korean government on how to deal with nuclear North Korea from now on. I think there are two different groups of foreign policy advisors surrounding President-elect Joe Biden. One group is the traditional or regional expert who has been dealing with East Asian affairs. Of course, there are majority of the group is about China hands, but still around Joe Biden, there are a good number of security experts on the Korean Peninsula issues. Jake Sullivan, who is going to be very possibly going to be state secretary, according to the media report in the United States, he has a very clear framework on North Korea and the North Korean denuclearization process. He asserted the Iran model is something that North Korean denuclearization process should follow. And Frank Zanuzzi, the former aide of President-elect Joe Biden, has an experience to deal with North Korea directly by visiting North Korea many years ago. So it is going to be completely different from the Trump administration's approach, which heavily relied on President Trump himself. He wanted to be a chief negotiator itself. He did not pay sufficient attention to the policy advisors. The second group of the Joe Biden administration in dealing with East Asian affairs and North Korean denuclearization process was non-proliferation group. Non-proliferation group is, of course, a minority to the traditional regional experts on East Asian affairs. But this second group tend to prefer so-called freezing option, which we did not failed to accomplish in the Hanoi summit, so-called small deal. So from this time on, after the several months policy coordination between the United States and South Korea, I think the freezing option, which we missed at the Hanoi summit, could be a meaningful and good enough starting point for the denuclearization. And then we can talk about the sanction alleviation with the snapback clause.
Thank you very much, Dr. Song. And this may be the final question for Dr. Swanstrom. You say you go to North Korea and you see signs of economic regeneration, if not regeneration, then at least signs of economic viability. You mentioned that the people have more consumer goods. And this seems to contradict the data on the North Korean economy, declining, being in a serious state of decline. So I wonder how in view of the sanctions on oil, especially their inability to generate energy, how you think they manage to keep their economy afloat and produce all of these light consumer goods?
Well, I was to say not legally. I mean, first of all, when we talk about consumer goods, of course, this is also mainly in Pyongyang. And this is directed towards an elite. There's a tremendous difference between Pyongyang and the countryside. I mean, we have to be aware of there's at least 3 or 4 circles where the further away from Pyongyang and the power centers, the more poverty, the more, the less consumer goods you have. Well, the thing is, it's just the Mali market, the campaigns, really. I mean, I spoke to a couple of colleagues who hasn't had a day off in more than a year. This was some time ago. They spend their weekends doing that sort of campaign work. That is, the armed forces has been used to in construction assignments, etc. So some of these economic activity is artificial in a sense, but then when it comes to oil and gas and all that, it comes from China and Russia. I mean, I would argue that this is part of the breaking of sanctions. And China has been very clear. We will not hurt the North Korean people. We will apply to sanctions, but we will not do it in a way that will hurt the people. So I think if we need to have an effective policy towards DPRK, if sanctions is the way forward, we have to have an international community that's in agreement. And when you look at that, before the Olympic Games, we actually had that. North Korea was much more willing to discuss. China was on board. We actually was moving in the same direction. Then pressure against North Korea was very successful. Today, we do not have that. Today, we have countries breaking the sanctions, moving outside. It makes it much more difficult. So maybe the problem is not so much how we deal with North Korea as how we deal with the international community and to make sure that we are on the same page. Just to say about the United States as well, I mean, what is positive with the Biden team, they have a very good team that has been discussed. Evans Revere has been one of the names that's been popping up, which is a good specialist. I mean, the other North Korean specialist that comes up. This indicates to me that we will see a bottom-up approach. Biden will not make the same mistake as Trump and having a top-down. He will try to consolidate small gains, move slowly but steadily. The big problem is, will China allow this? Will the Congress allow this? It's not only what Biden would and his team would like to do. They're fighting the structures around it. I think that the North Korea team that Biden seems to be setting up is extremely skillful and could have a good success rate if they were allowed to work freely, and I don't think they are. I think we are stuck in this domestic politics and geopolitics, and that will make it much, much more difficult. And here again, this is where South Korea needs to step in. South Korea is one of these positive actors who can guide the process in a way that nobody else is willing to do. Because for South Korea, regardless of a conservative government or a more liberal government, needs stability and security. So here is, I think, a lot of the efforts we do should be make sure that it includes South Korea. South Korea should be one of these anchors in this process. And unfortunately, I think we're going to end up again with we're going to look at China, United States, and North Korea. And that's exciting, it's big news, but it might not be that long-term engagement we need. So I'll stop there. So trying to somewhat positive, but trying to include South Korea there.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Swanstrom. We're coming towards the end of our time. Just a few takeaway points that we raised today. We all agree that North Korea has some real insecurity problems and that its perception needs to be recognized to move forward, that it also has real economic needs, science and technology, healthcare, disaster management, as well as energy. And the North Koreans have made clear that they want to advance on this front. So there's also an opportunity there. The China-US dispute is perceived by the North Koreans to be advantageous in some way. But on the other hand, resolving the North Korean nuclear crisis is not the immediate priority on the Chinese and the American agendas. We will have to wait for the Biden administration to see the restart of negotiations. And so I'd like to thank today's speakers for all their very, very interesting contributions, and to thank the Ministry of Unification for hosting this event. Also thank the audience. Tomorrow is the third day of our forum, where we discuss the role of Europe in peace building on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much for your participation, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.